The order came just before dawn, carried on a voice so flat it almost blended with the surf. Remove your clothes. The women froze. The humid air of Manila's port stuck to their skin like glue. Crates clattered, ropes strained, and somewhere in the distance, a British truck backfired. But on this line, 300 captured Japanese nurses, clerks, and civilians' time stopped. They had heard stories of Allied vengeance. Now it felt like their turn had come. One woman whispered, "So this is how we die." The guards didn't respond. They just waited, boots shifted on gravel, a seagull cried overhead. The smell of salt, diesel, and fear mixed into something metallic. Most of the women had marched for days before this, their uniforms stained with mud and blood. When the order came, it wasn't shouted, it was announced. Calm, procedural, almost rehearsed. That made it worse. In that stillness, a second voice broke through. British accent, young. "You will be inspected for lice and infection. Medical procedure. No harm will come to you." But the words didn't fit the moment. A soldier explaining mercy. Impossible. The women hesitated. The guards waited longer. Sweat rolled down spines. Dust clung to bare ankles. No one moved first. Then one woman, a former nurse named Aiko, stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she unbuttoned her tunic. The others followed, shame burning through fear. Behind them, Allied medics unfolded white sheets, not ropes. Not rifles, towels. The shock hit harder than any bullet. One British officer turned his face away as he handed Aiko a towel. She had expected disgust or cruelty, but saw embarrassment. That flicker of decency cracked something inside her. This wasn't how enemies behaved. As they dried off, she noticed the guards keeping their distance, heads bowed slightly as if acknowledging, not dominating the prisoners. The air felt different now, not safe but strange, too civilized for war. When the inspection ended, no one spoke. The women stood in stunned silence, still clutching their towels, unsure whether to thank their captors or fear what came next. But before they could decide, another voice called out, "Proceed to medical tents for further checks." The next step would show them what inspection truly meant. The women entered a canvas tent that smelled of iodine and wet canvas. Lanterns flickered against the khaki walls, and for the first time since their capture, they were out of the sun. Aiko clutched her towel tighter, her heartbeat louder than the shuffle of bare feet around her. She expected more humiliation, maybe interrogation, maybe photographs. Instead, a man in a faded British medical uniform stepped forward, clipboard in hand, eyes tired but steady. "Name?" he asked softly. No bark, no sneer, just procedure. Behind him, two nurses in white coats laid out disinfectant, gauze, and soap. The women exchanged confused glances. One whispered, "They're treating us." The officer, Captain Wallace, didn't look at their faces as he worked. He noted bruises, checked for fever, applied ointment to open wounds. When he reached Aiko, he paused. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "You're safe here," he murmured, though he knew the words would mean little. Outside, the noise of ships and trucks bled through the tent flaps. The war still roared beyond this small, strange island of mercy. But inside, something fragile was forming, a truce that no general had ordered. Aiko couldn't stop watching him, not because he was kind, but because he seemed burdened by that kindness, as if decency itself was dangerous. She noticed how he turned his head away each time a woman reached for a towel. No smirks, no lingering eyes. Just discomfort, the kind that comes from empathy. Later, the women were led to a wash basin, hot water. Actual soap. Their reflection in the steel basin made them flinch, filthy, thin, unrecognizable, but alive. And no one shouted at them, no one struck them. Back home, Aiko whispered to the woman beside her, "They would have left us to rot if we failed." The nurse didn't reply. She just nodded slowly, eyes filling with something that wasn't quite tears. Maybe confusion, maybe guilt. By the time the inspection ended, the women were quiet, wrapped in clean blankets. The guards carried their old uniforms away to be burned. Outside, the setting sun threw long shadows over the tents. For the first time, Aiko realized these men didn't hate them. They pitied them, but pity, she would soon learn, could be more disarming than hate. By morning, the camp smelled of broth. Not gun oil or sweat. Broth. Steam curled from tin pots over open fires as British and Australian orderlies moved between the tents, handing out metal bowls. The Japanese women hesitated again. Every sense screamed trap. Their last warm meal had been months ago, served by their own army before surrendering. Since then, food had meant survival of the fittest, stealing, bargaining, enduring. Now the enemy offered soup. Eiko watched a soldier ladle brownish liquid into her bowl. He didn't speak Japanese, but he smiled awkwardly, gesturing for her to eat. She waited for others to taste it first. No one fell. The smell, meat, onions, maybe barley, was too real to resist. When she finally raised the spoon, the warmth hit like a shock. It wasn't just food, it was proof that something she'd believed about the enemy was wrong. Nearby, a guard offered bread, real bread. Soft, white, still warm from an oven somewhere. Eiko took a piece and stared at it like it was a relic. "They feed us better than our officers did," whispered one nurse. The guard didn't react, he probably didn't understand, but the line stayed in the air like confession. Across Allied camps, reports noted similar moments. Statistically, a Japanese POW had nearly double the survival rate under Allied control than Allied prisoners under Japan. Rough math, 72% versus 35%. Numbers cold as stone, yet here, every sip of soup felt like defiance against those odds. Eiko tried to keep her face blank. She didn't want them to see gratitude. But when the same soldier refilled her bowl without being asked, her control cracked. "Why?" she muttered half to herself. He shrugged, motioning to the Red Cross symbol painted on the kitchen crate. Rules, not mercy rules. Somehow, that made it even harder to process. Later, when the bowls were collected, Eiko caught her reflection in the pot's sheen. Eyes swollen, but alive. Around her, women whispered prayers they hadn't said since childhood. For the first time since capture, they weren't thinking about death. They were thinking about tomorrow. But that small comfort would soon be tested. Because the next order from the camp commandant would drag them back into fear, one that looked at first like friendship. By the third day, the shock had turned into a strange kind of routine. Wake up, line up, eat, wash. But nothing felt real. The barbed wire glinted in the morning sun. Guards patrolled with rifles, but they smiled. Eiko couldn't understand this world where captors handed cigarettes to prisoners. It went against everything she'd been taught about honor, enemy, and shame. Near the fence, an Australian corporal flicked a lighter open and gestured toward the group. "Smoke," he offered in slow, broken Japanese. A few women turned away, suspicious, but one reached out trembling. When the first puff hit her lungs, she coughed, then laughed. A dry, stunned laugh that spread through the group like static. Within minutes, the fence line looked like a small cafe after battle. Prisoners sitting cross-legged, sharing cigarettes, whispering. It wasn't comfort. It was confusion. Their training had painted the Allies as monsters. Yet here was a man who apologized when he accidentally brushed a prisoner's arm. Eiko noted the detail like a scientist cataloguing an impossible specimen. Behind her, the British sergeant, the same one from the inspection, watched silently. He kept the routine strict, meals on time, roll calls precise, medical checks regular. Yet beneath the discipline, there was an undercurrent of respect. "They treat us like soldiers," one woman muttered, half in disbelief. Another corrected her, "No, like humans." That evening, Eiko was summoned to assist in the infirmary. She had once been a nurse. They needed help sorting supplies. Inside, she saw boxes stamped Medical Corps, Commonwealth, clean bandages, morphine, quinine. She'd never seen abundance like this. Japan's own hospitals had been running on scraps by the war's final year. She couldn't help whispering they had too much to lose. Industrial victory was visible in every gauze roll and tin cup. When the shift ended, the same Australian corporal from the fence handed her a cigarette. She hesitated. "Why?" she asked. He exhaled smoke and grinned. "Because you look like you need one." That night, Eiko couldn't sleep. She wrote something on a scrap of ration paper. Just one line, folded carefully into her blanket. "The enemy is not what we were told." But by morning, that note would disappear, taken during inspection and never seen again. The note Echo had written was gone by sunrise. The guards had searched the barracks at dawn, routine, efficient, emotionless. Every scrap of paper was confiscated, every folded corner flattened by foreign hands. When the inspection ended, Echo's blanket felt lighter, as if a piece of her had been taken with it. Around her, murmurs spread, letters, drawings, even pressed flowers all gone. That afternoon, a British corporal read the camp bulletin aloud. No personal correspondence permitted until review by command. The announcement echoed through the yard, translated in fragments by a Japanese interpreter. Some women lowered their heads, others stared blankly at the ground. They weren't angry, just hollow. For them, words were the only escape. Echo couldn't let it end there. That night, under the dim lantern light, she began writing again, this time on the back of a medical label. To whoever finds this, she began, I was taught that surrender erased honor, but here I see men who show more honor than those who taught me. Her hand trembled, but the words felt alive. By the end of the week, dozens of such letters circulated secretly among the POW. They weren't messages home. They were quiet confessions, some apologizing to the dead, others describing small mercies. Historians later found that over 17,000 POW letters like these were archived, censored, or destroyed in Allied custody. Most were never read by their intended recipients. One evening, as Echo folded her letter, a familiar voice interrupted. The British Sergeant Wallace stood in the doorway. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply said, "You shouldn't risk this." His tone wasn't threatening. It was weary, almost protective. She met his eyes and asked softly, "Why do you care?" He didn't answer. Just took the paper, hesitated, and slipped it into his pocket. Days passed. Rumors spread that some guards were keeping the letters not for intelligence, but because they couldn't throw them away. Human words, written by the enemy, were harder to destroy than orders. Echo never saw her letter again. But weeks later, she noticed the sergeant carried something folded inside his chest pocket, always pressed against his heart. She never asked if it was hers. She didn't need to. That letter, sealed in silence, would soon decide both their fates, though neither could imagine how. Sergeant Wallace sat on the edge of his bunk, the camp muffled in post. Curfew silence. Outside, the jungle hummed with crickets and distant truck engines, but his focus was on a folded piece of paper resting in his palm. The letter. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, shaped by discipline. He had confiscated dozens before, all destroyed per protocol. But this one he'd kept. He told himself it was for documentation. He knew that was a lie. He unfolded it again. The ink had bled slightly from sweat and humidity, but the words remained clear. They treat us with respect we do not deserve. Perhaps that is their strength. Wallace read it twice, 3 times. He'd seen his share of prisoners, some violent, some broken, but never anyone who mirrored his own doubts back at him. Every guard had a coping rule, don't think too much. But after months on duty, the walls between duty and empathy were wearing thin. Commanders didn't warn you about that. They taught you how to keep order, not how to stay human. The next morning, during roll call, Wallace caught Echo's eye for a moment longer than he should have. She bowed slightly, a gesture of quiet understanding, not defiance. That single moment would have gone unnoticed if another soldier hadn't been watching. By midday, rumors crawled through the barracks, the Brits gone soft. He's protecting one of them. It wasn't true, but truth mattered less than perception in war. That night, Lieutenant Harris summoned him. Keep your distance, Wallace. The officer warned, we're not here to make friends. Wallace nodded, jaw tight. Yes, sir. But his mind replayed the words from her letter again and again. Allied records from 1945 show nearly 1 in 12 guards reported psychological strain from prolonged POW contact. The military called it sentimental fatigue. Wallace called it conscience. He returned to his post, the folded letter still in his pocket. The barbed wire gleamed in moonlight. Echo stood near the fence, silent. Their eyes met briefly, 2 prisoners of circumstance, divided by rules neither believed in anymore. Behind them, whispers grew. The camp was changing. Kindness had become suspect. The very humanity that had once shocked the prisoners was now turning against the men who showed it. And before long, the whispers would become orders. By the end of that week, the camp felt colder. though the Manila heat hadn't changed. Soldiers spoke less, smoked more. The easy banter that once drifted between guards was replaced by murmurs. "You hear about Wallace," someone whispered in the mess hall, "reads their letters, talks to them like people." A few laughed, others didn't. In war, mercy was dangerous. It blurred the line that made killing possible. Rumors spread fast in isolation. The cooks claimed Wallace gave extra bread to a Japanese nurse. The quartermaster swore he saw him pass something folded through the fence. None of it could be proven, but in the machinery of military gossip, proof wasn't needed. By the third retelling, Wallace wasn't just a lenient guard, he was a sympathizer. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very decency they were ordered to show, the Geneva rules, the medical inspections, the humane rations, was now being twisted into suspicion. One corporal muttered, "You treat them soft, they'll stab you in the back." Another replied, "She looks harmless till the knife's in your ribs." It didn't matter that there hadn't been a single escape attempt. Fear was oxygen in the barracks. Aiko noticed the change too. The cigarettes stopped, the smiles vanished, the guards looked through the prisoners, not at them. The small world of civility they'd built was cracking. One afternoon, during laundry duty, Aiko overheard two Australian privates arguing outside the supply shed. "You really think those women are just nurses?" One said, "Spies more like. They know codes, radio ops, bet half of them were trained." The other shrugged. "Maybe, but they're beaten now. Leave it." That night, Wallace found a note on his cot. It wasn't signed. Just 3 words scrawled in pencil, "Watch your back." Reports from 1945 confirm that over 300 suspected espionage cases surfaced across Allied Pacific commands. Most proved false, but paranoia never needed evidence. By morning, new orders were posted on the bulletin board. Certain detainees to be relocated. Immediate transfer at dawn. A list followed. Aiko's name was on it. When Wallace saw it, his throat went dry. He understood transfers happened all the time. But this felt like erasure, and as the trucks lined up under the floodlights, he knew he'd have to decide whether to obey his orders or defy them. The trucks were already idling when dawn cracked open the Manila sky. Headlights cut through mist and dust, throwing long white beams across the yard. Prisoners stood in rows, silent, expressionless, clutching their few possessions in burlap sacks. The sound of engines drowned out the birds. Aiko was in the second row. Her name had been called 30 minutes earlier, her number stenciled onto a clipboard she wasn't allowed to see. Wallace scanned the manifest again. 50. 1 prisoner scheduled for transfer to the American sector. Routine relocation. The lieutenant had said, but Wallace knew the pattern, the troublemakers, the outspoken, the ones who'd drawn too much attention. And Aiko was on it. She caught his gaze once as the guards began to count heads. No words, just that same quiet recognition that had formed between them weeks ago. He wanted to say something, but speech felt dangerous now. The convoy commander barked, "Move." Boots crunched on gravel, chains rattled softly, not restraints, but the sound of metal tailgates slamming shut. Each truck took on its load of prisoners, engines revving in rhythm. Wallace walked alongside, clipboard pressed to his chest. When Aiko climbed aboard, she turned, hesitated, then did something that froze him completely. She saluted. Not a gesture of mockery or surrender, but respect. A soldier's acknowledgement of another. The nearby guards didn't notice. Wallace stiffened instinctively, returned the salute with the smallest nod he dared risk. Aiko's last glimpse of him was through the slats of the truck's wooden side panels. Dust rose behind the convoy as it began to roll forward, sunlight bouncing off the barbed wire one last time. Reports show that nearly half of all POW transfers during the Pacific campaigns took place before sunrise, minimizing risk of sabotage or escape. To the prisoners, it only magnified the sense of vanishing into the dark. As the vehicles rumbled out of the British compound, Wallace stood by the gate, helmet under his arm. The convoy faded into the haze, swallowed by the road leading toward the American run camp near Batangas. He didn't move for a long time, but his thoughts followed the trucks. He had her letter, her handwriting, her story folded in his pocket. and a growing suspicion that this transfer was no ordinary relocation, because the Americans ran their camps differently, colder, cleaner, and far less forgiving. The American camp didn't smell like war, it smelled like bleach and asphalt. When the convoy rolled through the gates, Aiko's first impression was the silence. No shouting, no chaos, just order. Whitewashed barracks in perfect rows, flags snapping in the coastal wind, guards in pressed uniforms who barely glanced at the prisoners. Everything was efficient, sterile, and impersonal. A sergeant with a clipboard called out names in quick, flat English. Each woman stepped forward, was assigned a number, then guided to a designated bunk. It felt less like captivity and more like processing, like being turned into data. The British had treated them like people. The Americans treated them like paperwork. Aiko tried to understand the new rhythm. Meals were exact 7, 00, 12, 00, 18, 00, hygiene inspections daily, medical checks weekly. Even their movements between barracks were timed. The food wasn't bad. Canned beans, bread, coffee, but it tasted of metal and control. The Americans spoke less, smiled less. Their kindness was procedural, not emotional. The Red Cross emblem hung on every building, but no one looked up when the prisoners passed. Compassion here had been industrialized. At night, Aiko lay awake, staring at the corrugated roof glinting in the moonlight. The ocean roared faintly in the distance, a reminder of freedom just beyond the wire. She missed the British sergeant's quiet nods, the small gestures that had felt human. Here, the guards didn't look away when the women undressed for inspection. They didn't look at all. Reports show that after 1945, American POW facilities processed more than 10 zero-axis captives per week across the Pacific Theater. Efficiency meant survival, but also distance. Aiko learned the new rules quickly: obey, stay invisible, forget softness. Yet part of her couldn't forget the towel handed to her in Manila, the cigarette shared through a fence. Humanity, once tasted, couldn't be untasted. One afternoon, a notice appeared on the barracks door, typed in block letters: mandatory showers, all detainees, hygiene inspection. The words sent a ripple of dread through the room. The women froze, their minds flashing back to the first command at the port: undress. No one spoke. The past was looping back, and they didn't yet know if mercy had an expiration date. The order was posted at dawn: all detainees to report to the hygiene station. No exceptions. Aiko stood in line again, the sun just beginning to climb, baking the corrugated roofs in gold. The déjà vu was suffocating. The same posture, the same words: undress. Only this time the guard's tone was clipped, administrative, like reading from a manual. Inside the concrete shower block, the air stung of disinfectant and wet lime. Pipes ran across the ceiling, valves hissing softly. American medics moved briskly, rubber gloves snapping as they gestured the prisoners forward. No malice, no hesitation, just the hum of machinery, and orders obeyed. Aiko's stomach knotted. The memory of that first moment in Manila, the towel, the terror, rushed back. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Do you think it's the same?" The woman didn't answer. Steam hissed, echoing like distant shellfire. Then a spray of fine mist filled the room. The women flinched, shielding their faces. But it wasn't gas. It was disinfectant. Cold, sharp, the smell of DDT mixed with soap and metal, flooding every sense. One of the nurses in white coats shouted over the noise, "Keep your eyes closed, 2 minutes." The Americans had reduced hygiene to science. Every motion timed, every droplet measured. The result: fewer outbreaks, fewer deaths. Reports note a 90% reduction in disease in camps that used DDT protocols. To the medics, it was victory through sanitation. To the prisoners, it was confusion through kindness. As Aiko scrubbed herself with the coarse soap, something inside her shifted. This wasn't humiliation anymore. It was decontamination. They weren't cleansing her as an enemy, but as a human organism. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a puddle at her feet, hair matted, skin raw but alive. When the valves shut off, silence fell except for the dripping water. The guards handed out towels, faces blank, detached. Aiko wrapped herself, trembling. For a fleeting second, she realized the fear had evaporated. Not because she trusted them, but because this ritual wasn't about power. It was about procedure. As the line moved toward the exit, the mirror above the basin caught her reflection again. For the first time, she saw no prisoner, no enemy, just a survivor, but that reflection would haunt her because soon she'd have to face what survival really meant. When the steam cleared, the mirrors told stories no one wanted to face. The room was silent except for the slow drip of water onto concrete. Aiko stood before a fogged mirror, her towel clutched around her shoulders, watching her own eyes emerge through the haze. They looked older, hollow, searching, almost unrecognizable. For months she'd imagined her captors as devils. Now, staring at her own reflection, she wasn't sure who the devil had been. She reached out and wiped the glass. The motion revealed the thin scar running across her collarbone, a wound from a shell fragment during the retreat from Baton. She remembered her commander telling her, "Pain proves loyalty." But here, pain had no purpose. It wasn't demanded. It wasn't rewarded, it just existed. Behind her, a medic handed out clean underclothes, plain and white. The women took them silently, moving with mechanical precision. Their uniforms, the symbols of their empire, were gone, burned the night before. All that remained was the human form beneath. The transformation was quiet but profound. Later health reports would record measurable changes. Body weight increasing by 40% in 6 months, disease nearly eliminated. Yet no statistic could capture what was happening inside these women's minds. The enemy's mercy was dismantling their faith in everything they'd been taught. Aiko found herself helping the weakest among them, holding hands, sharing rations, whispering comfort. Empathy, once seen as weakness, now felt like rebellion. "They clean our bodies," she murmured one night, "and somehow they clean our hatred too." The camp routines became her new clock. Morning roll call, meals, hygiene checks. The guards remained distant but predictable, and predictability was a strange kind of safety. For the first time, sleep came without nightmares. One evening, as the sun bled across the Pacific horizon, she stood near the wire fence and caught sight of an Allied truck arriving with newspapers. The war, it seemed, was moving somewhere she couldn't see. Whispers spread among the prisoners. Tokyo bombed, the Emperor silent, strange new weapons mentioned in coded tones. That night, Aiko returned to the mirror. The same face stared back, but this time there was no fear, no disbelief. Just waiting. She didn't know it yet, but the next sound she'd hear would not be gunfire. It would be surrender. The announcement came not with gunfire or trumpets, but through a crackling loudspeaker mounted on a jeep. Midday, August 15, 1945. The American camp stood still under the burning tropical sun as a sergeant adjusted the dial, his voice barely louder than the static. "Japan has accepted the terms of unconditional surrender." For a moment no one moved. The words hung in the humid air like smoke after a blast. The Japanese women froze in place, hands still mid-task. Laundry buckets half-dipped, spoons paused over tin plates. No cheering, no collapse, just silence so complete that even the wind seemed to stop. Aiko's breath caught. She'd imagined this day 1,000 ways. Fire, vengeance, collapse. But this, a single voice declaring the end of everything she'd believed in. It felt unreal. Around her, the women stared at one another, as if waiting for someone to interpret the meaning. The American guards didn't celebrate either. They simply removed their helmets and stood in stillness. Even they seemed to sense that this wasn't victory. It was a eulogy. The world they'd fought to destroy had surrendered, and yet no one looked triumphant. Aiko sank to her knees, not from grief but from confusion. If surrender wasn't shame, what was it? She remembered the mirror, the towel, the cigarette, the small mercies that had redefined her idea of enemy and honor. Maybe this moment wasn't defeat but release. Nearby, an American officer lowered the camp flag to half, masked a gesture that made the women whisper. Respect for them, for the dead, for everyone who hadn't survived long enough to hear the radio crackle. The loudspeaker played faint music next, a static-riddled broadcast of Emperor Hirohito's voice, formal and restrained. Words most of them couldn't hear clearly but knew by tone. It wasn't surrender as humiliation, it was surrender as survival. One woman began to cry, softly, almost politely. Another followed, but Eiko stayed still, her face dry, her heart strangely calm. For the first time, she thought, we are all just human. The guards began to walk the perimeter again, but slower now, as if unsure what came next. The war had ended, but the camp gates didn't open. Because peace, she realized, doesn't arrive with a key. It arrives with waiting. The ocean was glass when the repatriation ship left Manila Bay. Rows of Japanese women stood along the railing, their khaki, issued coats fluttering in the warm wind, watching the city shrink into haze. The war was over, but the air still carried its taste, salt, rust, and memory. Eiko leaned against the railing, a small canvas bag at her feet. Inside, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and nothing else. The Allies had given them back their freedom, but freedom didn't feel familiar anymore. For days, the ship sailed through calm waters, cutting across an invisible map of battlefields. Each sunrise painted the deck in silver light, and each evening the women gathered quietly, staring toward a home they couldn't picture anymore. The guards on board treated them well enough. Polite distance, measured respect, but no one spoke much. It was as if everyone understood that words might break the fragile silence holding the world together. Eiko kept thinking of the mirror, the towel, the letter she'd written, the one Wallace had kept. She wondered if he'd survived, or if his conscience had cost him more than his rank. There was no way to know. All that remained were fragments, moments of decency in a war built on cruelty. When Japan's coastline finally appeared, a grey silhouette through mist, no one cheered. Some women cried quietly, others just stared. The docks were crowded with officials, nurses, and silent men in armbands reading Repatriation Authority. The city beyond was unrecognizable. Tokyo lay in ruins, rooftops twisted like paper, streets lined with scorched brick. Even the air smelled different, smoke mixed with seaweed, the scent of defeat. Over 4 million Japanese citizens would return home between 1945 and 1950. But home, for most, no longer existed. The empire they'd pledged their lives to had vanished. What waited was hunger, shame, and uncertainty. As Eiko stepped off the ship, she clutched her bag tighter. A child offered her a rice ball through the fence, half cracked, still warm. She bowed, tears burning her eyes. Kindness again from a stranger, just when she thought she'd forgotten what it looked like. That night, in a crowded dormitory, she unpacked her few belongings. At the bottom of the bag, folded and yellowed, was the paper the guards had missed, the unfinished letter she thought was gone. It was waiting for an ending. Years passed before anyone opened the envelope again. By then, the paper had yellowed, the ink had bled slightly, but Eiko's handwriting was still graceful, disciplined, even in sorrow. She'd hidden the letter for decades, folded into the lining of an old coat she refused to throw away. Time moved on. Occupation, rebuilding, a new flag, a new anthem. But every August, when the cicadas began to hum, she'd find herself touching that hidden pocket, remembering the day she first wrote those words. In 2019, long after her death, her granddaughter donated the coat to a small history museum in Canberra. The archivist almost missed it. The paper was tucked deep inside, fragile as ash. When unfolded, the first line read, "To the man who showed me mercy when war forgot how." The handwriting was dated 1945. No surname, just Eiko. The letter described the Manila camp, the towel, the cigarette, the transfer. It wasn't a love letter. It was a record of transformation. I believed we were told to die with honor. It read, "But you taught me there is honor in letting others live." Curators traced the details and found a matching name in British war logs. Sergeant David Wallace, Royal Army Medical Corps, survived 1945, discharged in 46. Among his effects donated by his son decades later was a small bundle of personal items. Inside, a folded letter written in Japanese, translated by hand on the back in pencil. The same phrases, the same handwriting, 2 letters, 2 sides of the same war, preserved continents apart. The historian who discovered them wrote, it wasn't strategy that ended their hatred, it was small decencies. The documents became part of an exhibit titled Mercy Outlasts Victory. Visitors would stop in front of the display, reading her words beneath the dim museum lights. No uniforms, no medals, just handwriting and silence. In the final line, Aiko had written, "If this letter survives, let it tell the truth. The enemy I feared most was my own heart." Her granddaughter stood before that glass case on opening day, eyes wet, whispering her name. Outside, rain tapped against the museum windows, soft, persistent, like the echo of a ship engine fading into fog. War had ended 70 years earlier, but her words were still marching on.